The world changed in a matter of hours, and by the time Joe Rogan took the mic, millions were already watching, listening, and waiting for answers. What began as coordinated military action by the United States and Israel against Iran, one of the most serious joint offensives in decades, had spiraled into a region-wide confrontation, with missiles flying back toward Israel and allied forces as explosions echoed across the Middle East. In the early hours of February 28, a massive aerial and missile campaign struck deep into Iran. The offensive, dubbed Operation Epic Fury by Western officials and Operation Lion's Roar by Israeli commanders, targeted hundreds of military sites, including air defense networks, missile launch facilities, and command and control installations. U.S. and Israeli aircraft, along with long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles, hit strategic infrastructure across major Iranian cities, including Tehran, Isfahan, and Qom, marking the most ambitious military operation against Iran in decades. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, a figure who had governed the Islamic Republic since 1989, was killed in the initial strikes, along with senior commanders and members of his family, according to multiple sources. The loss of Khamenei sent shockwaves through Tehran and beyond, immediately destabilizing Iran's political hierarchy and drawing swift vows of revenge from the government. By the time news of these developments reached the public, Iran had already launched its retaliatory barrage. Missiles and drones streaked toward Israeli population centers and U.S. military bases stationed across the Gulf. Government officials in the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia reported incoming Iranian ballistic missiles, some intercepted and others causing damage, including civilian casualties and disruption to infrastructure and air traffic. It was against this tense backdrop that Joe Rogan, host of one of the most listened-to media platforms in the world, offered what would quickly become one of the most shared analyses of the conflict. Rogan didn't open with slogans or sensational claims. Instead, he began by stating what was already clear. This was no minor strike. The joint offensive by the U.S. and Israel was historic in scale, intensity, and consequence. The offensive had shattered years of strategic assumptions about restraint in the region, and Iran's incredible capacity for asymmetric response was now visible to the world. He explained that Iran's missile retaliation was not random or impulsive, it was strategic. Iran's leadership had declared that the attacks on their territory, and particularly the death of Khamenei, crossed every red line. In Tehran's calculus, failing to respond assertively would signal weakness, potentially emboldening adversaries and undermining the regime's grip at home. So Iran unleashed ballistic missiles and drones, not only at Israel, but at U.S. forces and allied bases throughout the Gulf, a move that elevated the conflict beyond a bilateral dispute. But Rogan didn't stop at the military dimension. He walked his audience through the broader significance of what was happening, geopolitical, economic, and psychological. He pointed out that when missiles cross borders and civilian casualties mount, the entire concept of deterrence changes. It is no longer about symbolic retaliation. It becomes about testing will and endurance. That is why Iranian missiles reached toward UK military bases in Cyprus, foreign fleet assets in the Eastern Mediterranean, and Gulf capitals, moves that signaled Tehran's intent to redefine the costs of confrontation. He emphasized that this dynamic was not just about weapon systems on maps, but about perception. Once a nation perceives that its leadership has been decapitated, its options narrow, and its willingness to retaliate, proportionally or not, increases. Iran's missile launches, then, were as much psychological signals as they were physical attacks. Signals that Tehran will not bow, that it still commands regional reach, and that it intends to impose pain on those who struck its sovereign territory. Rogan then turned to the regional implications. The Middle East's interconnected nature means that missiles fired at one capital reverberate through every other capital. Airspaces were closed, civilian travel was disrupted. Global oil markets reacted sharply as traders priced in risk around the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which a significant portion of the world's petroleum flows daily. With Iran now directly engaged against U.S., Israeli, and allied forces, no business-as-usual scenario remained plausible. He also highlighted the diplomatic fallout. At the United Nations Security Council, the conflict had erupted into public confrontation. The U.S. defended its actions as lawful measures to prevent a threat, while Iran's representatives condemned the attacks as illegal and disproportionate. Russia, China, and several Arab League members called for immediate ceasefires and a return to negotiations, warning of catastrophic escalation if hostilities continued unabated. Rogan did not claim to know exactly what would happen next. No analyst can. But he laid out the plausible frameworks for escalation. Further missile barrages from Iran, expanded air operations by Israel, increased troop deployments across the Gulf, cyber attacks targeting critical infrastructure, economic sanctions and counter-sanctions, and proxy activations from groups aligned with Tehran. And he made a point that stuck with many listeners. Modern conflict is rarely linear. It unfolds across multiple domains simultaneously, and escalation in one domain often produces repercussions in another. Perhaps most striking was his emphasis on uncertainty. In a world where media cycles demand clear narratives, winners and losers, heroes and villains, the reality on the ground is far messier. Iran's response was not just a reply to a military strike, it was a statement of existence, identity, and defiance. And when both sides of a conflict believe they are fighting for survival or legitimacy, the space for negotiation narrows rapidly. By the end of his breakdown, Rogan had transformed a complex geopolitical flashpoint into a story that millions could grasp. A story not of isolated attacks, but of a multi-layered confrontation with unpredictable consequences. People understand what it means when missiles fly, when governments mobilize, and when global institutions call emergency sessions. What they rarely hear, yet what Rogan offered, is why those moments matter and how they could shape the world beyond the headlines. When the episode concluded, social media lit up with quotes from his analysis, and news outlets began referencing his commentary as part of the broader discussion about the crisis. The reason was simple. In a moment of alarm and uncertainty, Rogan had provided context, not certainty, but a framework for understanding the conflict as it unfolded. The situation remains volatile. Diplomats are meeting, militaries are on high alert, markets are jittery, and ordinary people in cities across the region are living with the reality of missiles overhead and sirens in the night. But the real takeaway from Rogan's viral breakdown was this. When major powers engage militarily, and when retaliation follows in kind, the world does not simply watch, it becomes part of the story. And understanding why requires looking past the sound bites to see the bigger strategic picture that ties weapon systems, politics, economies, and human lives together in an unpredictable, dangerous era.